Harvests lost, infrastructure washed away, populations forced to relocate. The effects of climate change have a cost. And impacts which go beyond what communities can adapt to or prepare for are known as loss and damage. One report from a group of vulnerable countries suggests they missed out on 20% of GDP growth over the first 2 decades of this century because of climate change. This COP, financial support for loss and damage has been included in the agenda for the first time.
Small island states, they have limited financial resources. Many of these countries, they've had to borrow repeatedly to repair damaged infrastructure from the effects of climate change, especially from storms, these ferocious storms that have decimated the infrastructure, the economies year after year. So it requires, therefore, some form of compensation in the form. We see this as a form of climate justice, one in which the polluter, is called upon to pay.
This idea hasn't come out of nowhere. Way back in 1991, years before even the first big UN climate conference was held, the Alliance of Small Island States put forward an idea. They suggested industrialised nations, those emitting the greenhouse gases, should have to pay into an insurance fund to compensate victims of sea level rises. Over the decades which followed, countries have tried eye-catching ways to get attention for their needs. At these conferences, however, with more than 190 countries taking the stage, discussions which use terms like climate justice can get bogged down in questions of responsibility. And the UK has literal history here. We powered our industrial revolution with a fossil fuel, coal. At that time, the UK was responsible for 100% of the world's emissions. That plummeted. Today, it's under 5% of cumulative historic emissions, largely because other countries, like the US, large swathes of Europe, and later China, joined in. The argument is those countries used emissions to create wealth. Wealth that some say should now help pay for the consequences of the warming it created. Developed nations, however, have long been resistant to the idea they may hold any legal liability.
I think that resistance has grown more and more over time. We saw that again in Glasgow last year at the climate change negotiations, where developing countries had come together and reached a very broad consensus on what they wanted to see happening on loss and damage, the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. But again, that was rejected by the US and the EU. Leaving a lot of developing country negotiators going home sorely disappointed.
Developing nations are conscious that linking who pays for loss and damage funding to historic emissions opens up accusations that any payments would essentially be akin to reparations and makes them highly unlikely to succeed. Research shows that over the years they've used language like compensation less and less. Now they're aiming for something different.
We accept that to link it to historical emissions will create a funding problem for countries that have had maybe centuries producing fossil fuel energy products. So we're not asking for any retroactive application of the loss and damage initiative, but certainly to have a facility in place in which we'll be holding these large producers of fossil fuel energy accountable.
It could be that how much countries are asked to pay in is linked to current emissions. If it's not successful this year, after being discussed for so long, what do you think will happen?
I think the very legitimacy of this UN climate system is potentially up for play if an agreement isn't reached this year. So I think having spent now a good decade talking about this in earnest, having established bodies that have been meant to address this, not seeing progress this year would be incredibly frustrating and I think would threaten potentially the whole system.
Some loss and damage funding has already been freely offered. Scotland pledged £1 million last year. This week, the UK government announced more than £20 million to help vulnerable countries afford insurance and respond more quickly after a disaster. But when you remember that this year's Pakistan floods are estimated to need $40 billion alone, that suddenly seems like a drop in a rapidly rising ocean.